Welcome to our fourth session in our study of 1 Peter, Persistence Through Difficulty. In this session, we're going to take a look at 1 Peter 3:1 to chapter 4, verse 6. And we're going to continue looking at how Christians are to inhabit the society in which they find themselves and to try to transform it from within as witnesses. Now, last time we looked at Peter's advice and direction to those who were slaves. And we saw that he called them to a pretty radical role, nothing less than the conversion of their masters or owners. Now let's take a look at what he has to say about husbands and wives, and then he's going to have some general things to say for all the members of his congregation. So let's begin by looking at 1 Peter 3:1 through 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, that is, they're not Christians, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So here we have some household advice. Let's kind of walk through the advice and see what Peter is trying to say. So notice here we have the same advice that's given to slaves that's now given to wives. Be subject to, and once again, Peter's meaning here, don't withdraw from. And initially, he's addressing women who are married to pagan men. So if you become a Christian, your husband is still a pagan, don't withdraw from that relationship. Seek to transform your husband from within the context of that relationship. Now, a brief word here is needed about the role of women in the Greco-Roman world. It's hard to make generalizations about the status and role of women all over the Greco-Roman world. Some women obviously had fairly high positions of status, but generally speaking, women were not involved in politics or business or things like this. The understanding was that the role of the woman was to run the household, to raise the children, and things like this. The key thing that we want to remember here, though, and the way that we're going to see Peter's advice as being radical is this. The expectation throughout the Greco-Roman world was if you were a woman and you married a man, you would then give up whatever religion and gods you had, and you would take on the gods and religion and religious practices of your husband. Notice that Peter is telling Christian women not to follow that expectation or custom. Indeed, he's actually saying the opposite. If you are a Christian woman and you find yourself married to a Christian man, not only are you not going to give up and embrace your husband's paganism, you're actually going to try and convert him to Christianity. So once again, Peter kind of lays out a pretty radical role for wives here. And the question is, well, how are they to do this? Well, they're to do this by focusing on the internal and not the external. He has some instruction here about the way that women adorn themselves, gold and jewelry and clothing. And once again, we just want to be careful here and recognize that in the Greco-Roman world, clothing was really important, not just for style's sake. Clothing in the Greco-Roman world advertised your social status. Different people dressed in different ways. The way that you dress designated what tier of society you were a part of. And Peter's telling these women, well, forget all that. That's not important. what you wear, what you put on, what kind of jewelry or whatever, that's really insignificant. In effect, right, status is insignificant. What's important is what's inside. What's important is your character. That's the thing that God looks upon. That's where real beauty lies. Real beauty lies within. Today we will probably talk about the beauty of the heart and mind. That's, I think, what Peter is getting at here. So that's what he's calling Christian wives to, okay? Forget the externals. Think about character. Think about the way that you live with your husband. And your role will be, once again, to be a witness for your husband to bring about his conversion. Once again, you are remaining in your place in society, but you're transforming it from within. Now, his advice to husbands is a little bit more brief. He says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So, a couple things here we want to notice. Peter says here that husbands are to live with their wives in a way that is understanding. And I think that's important. The idea here is that the husband here is to have a particular relationship with his wife that's going to differ from the way that marriage looks in the general Greco-Roman world. And I think what Peter says here actually comes very, very close to what Paul says to husbands in Ephesians 5, where remember Paul says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I think Peter's awfully close to that same sort of thing. Husbands, you may have authority over your wives, but it needs to be exercised in a particular way. Not simply as a sort of like a demanding dictator or commanding general, but rather you're to live with your wife in a way that is understanding, showing honor to your wife, and also recognizing that she is with you an heir of life, a recipient of grace. That is, you're to live with your wife in such a way that you recognize the fact that she too is a citizen under the King, capital K. The second thing we want to notice here is there's not just advice here about how husbands live with wives, there's also advice here about how men should treat the female slaves in their household, because Peter says here, honor the woman as the weaker vessel. So here we have a situation in the Greco-Roman world where there are going to be men who are heads of households, there are going to be female slaves in that households, and as you might imagine, the treatment that some of those female slaves received was horrendous. Peter is calling for something that is like radically different. The notion that you would treat a female slave in your household with honor, the notion that you would treat a female slave in your household as someone who with you is an heir of grace and life would have just been utterly mind-blowing. But that's what Peter's calling for. So notice once again, Peter's calling for Christians to live and to witness where they find themselves, but to do so in fairly radical ways, as a way, once again, of transforming their societies. Now, let's take a look at 1 Peter 3, 8 through 12. Here we get to the heart of Peter's theology of suffering, and so I do want to spend some time on this section because this is really the centerpiece of the letter. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now here, Peter's doing a number of important things that we just want to acknowledge. So let's take a look at some of the things he's commending now in the church in general. He's calling them to unity of mind. That is, all the qualities that he's about to list all have to do with the maintenance of the community of the church. Obviously, this would be, once again, a really important thing to think about in a hostile society, and even a society which has begun to persecute the Christian community. So let's take a look at some of the virtues he commends. Unity of mind. And here what we want to think about is not just that everybody thinks alike or thinks all the same things, but here unity of mind has to do with unity of purpose. That is, a key strategy for the success and survival of these churches is going to be unity in terms of purpose or mission. So unity of mind, where we're sort of all on the same page. The second thing that Peter asked be cultivated is sympathy and then brotherly love. Obviously, these will be important as well too, right? So sympathy is that kind of character disposition which inclines us to acts of mercy, which inclines us to identify with the sufferings of others. The same is true for brotherly love. I think maybe the thing to say here is what Peter's trying to sort of work at here is he's trying to get his churches to think of themselves basically as extended families. Not simply sort of as like almost like a club or an organization, but he's trying to get his communities of Christians to think of themselves as being related to one another, as sort of like members of an extended family, of an extended household, to use that term. So all these characteristics are essential. Another characteristic that he wants to have cultivated is what he calls a humble mind. Once again, this would have struck his original audience in the Greco-Roman world as really strange, because in this culture, pride is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to talk about how great you are. As a matter of fact, that's kind of most of what the great did, is they spent a great deal of time talking about how great they are, and they built statues of themselves, and they built temples, and had images of themselves made, and Peter's calling for something very different. He's calling his folks to step out of the cultural mold in which they live in and to be genuinely humble before God. Obviously, right, to be humble is to be open toward other people. Once again, to cultivate a sort of sense of sympathy, compassion, but also having a sense of obligation for others. That's all part of this cultivating a kind of humility of mind. Humility of mind here would be contrasted with a kind of prideful indifference. That's what Peter here, I think, is working at. Notice what he also says here. He says, bless, that their job is to don't repay evil for evil, don't revile when you're reviled, rather you should turn around and bless. This, of course, is very much like what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's essentially a paraphrase of that. Notice the point here, once again. How are Peter's churches to respond to persecution, to being called names, to having unfair things said about them? Their response is to not return what's thrown at them. That's their fundamental response, is not to throw back what is thrown at them, but rather to bless. That's their fundamental mission. Their fundamental mission in the world is to be witnesses to God, to bear witness to God through the way they live, and one of the ways they're going to do this is to actually act as agents of blessing. I think that's absolutely essential in terms of the way that Peter understands the witness that his people are carrying out in the world. Now, let's take a look at 1 Peter 3, 13 to 4, 6. There's some intricacy here, so we're going to have to kind of walk carefully. But there's a lot of rich teaching here that we don't want to miss. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if it should be God's will, than for doing evil. We've seen this theme before, so let's take a look at this. 1 Peter 3, 13 to 17. How are they to respond to attacks, to criticism? It's a pretty detailed piece of information, so let's take a look at it. Notice Peter's advice here, that if Christians are criticized, slandered, attacked, they should be criticized, slandered, attacked for doing good. Not for acting foolishly, not for saying foolish things, not for doing stupid things, not for saying stupid things. They should be attacked for doing and saying that which is good. And when they're placed under suffering, their response is to bless. And notice here a really important piece of advice. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. The question here, right, is how can people behave in the way that Peter wants them to behave under really difficult situations? That is, how can people respond to criticism or persecution in the way that Peter wants them to respond? And the answer, I think, is very clear. The only way that Peter's people are going to be able to bear an adequate witness is if their lives are centered and grounded in Christ. If that's not the case, they're going to respond to insults with more insults. They're going to respond to being reviled with reviling back. They're simply going to throw back what's thrown at them. The only way to not do this is to be grounded in Christ. As Peter says, to honor Christ in your hearts as Lord, as holy. And then he says this, be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Really important word here. The people in Peter's congregations are going to be able to live through difficulty and persecution because they have a hope that is wider than the world. Their hope is founded in the promises of God. Their hope is founded in the coming of Christ's kingdom. That's the thing that sustains them. And so Peter says, look, when someone asks you, why do you live this way, right? How do you do it? Peter's going to say, okay, there you have your golden opportunity. Tell them where it comes from. And of course, the answer to that question is going to be in a very simple way. It comes from Christ. How am I able to do what I do? It's because of Christ. How am I able to bless people who cursed me? It's because of Christ. How am I able to not throw insults back at people who insult me? It's because of Christ. So, in effect, right, here we go back to this idea of the Christian life as an act of ongoing witness based on hope and also based on faith. Notice what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:17. It's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. I think Peter is saying something that's very realistic here. Peter is in effect telling us, look, it's not a matter of whether suffering will come, but rather a matter of when. Don't be surprised if doing good brings on suffering. Don't be surprised if your doing good actually results in you suffering in some way. Peter's saying the reason why that's going to happen is because we live in a world which is not yet completely redeemed. Therefore, we need to expect suffering in the normal course of life. We shouldn't find it shocking or disappointing or that our faith is going to be destroyed by it. Okay, let's take a look now at 1 Peter 3, 18 and following. Here he says some really important things once again about Jesus' death. He's come back to that subject again. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh and made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is the right hand of God, with angels and authorities and powers having been subjected to him. Now, this is a very sort of controversial passage, maybe one of the most controversial in the whole of the New Testament. And we don't have time to deal with all the controversy. In a sense, we probably don't really even need to. The question here is this: why does Peter include this extended reflection on Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection in the context of advice on what to do under suffering? And I think the answer to that question is pretty clear. What Peter's trying to do here is he's trying to help us to see things sort of like in a larger picture. All Christian suffering, all Christian walking through difficulty has to be placed in the larger context of Jesus' suffering, death, resurrection, ascension, and then return in glory. That's the larger framework in which all current suffering has to be placed if we're to deal with it. So what's Peter trying to say here? Well, I think what he's trying to say is actually this, and I think it can be expressed fairly simply, although if you take a quick look or a close look at 3:18 to 22, it can be somewhat confusing because it's not always clear exactly what Peter has in mind. So here's a quick picture, a brief picture, I think, of what Peter's saying. Jesus suffers on the cross. He dies. He experiences the full reality of death. And in that death, he then goes to the place of the dead, where he does 2 things. First, he proclaims the good news to the righteous dead who are there in that place. Hades is not yet hell. This is sort of like the general place where all people go when they die. Jesus proclaims the good news to all the righteous dead from all the past. All righteous people who have lived before Christ then have the good news proclaimed to them. And secondly, Jesus subjects all the sort of the fallen angels, rebellious demons, all the kind of corrupted spirits. He then subjects them to his rule. And while this picture is not always completely clear, and while the lines aren't always completely drawn, I think the conclusion is pretty obvious. The consequence of Jesus' resurrection is complete, unmitigated, and total victory in this sense. Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection results in 2 things: Thing number one, the good news is proclaimed and extended to everyone in the past so that Jesus' redeeming work actually works backward, if you want to think about it that way. Hard to escape temporal categories. So Jesus' death actually works backward to all those people who were before him. And it also results in the complete subjection of all demons, all devils, all rebellious spirits, all sin. All those things are put under his authority. And so Peter says, look, if this victory is so complete and so comprehensive, what's there to be afraid of? What could you possibly be worried about? Or what could you possibly fear? If Jesus' victory is so comprehensive, so total, and so complete, if God's mercy is extended all the way back, and if God's power is exerted over all those things in rebellion against him, I mean, what more could you want? The victory here is complete, total, and absolute, and therefore it's worth witnessing to and worth suffering for. Okay, let's round this out by taking a look at 1 Peter 4, 1 through 6. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves in the same way, with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatry, etc., etc., etc. With respect to this, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. And they malign you. But they will give account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. Once again, a reference to Jesus going to the underworld and preaching to the righteous who were there. That though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. So once again, a few words about that somewhat complicated picture. To those Christians who are enduring suffering, or to those Christians who are about to endure suffering, Peter reminds them one more time, look, Christ suffered in the flesh. Christ actually suffered in his body. He had a human body, he suffered, he died. He experienced all of that. But, and here's his point, the willingness to take on suffering for Peter indicates something. The willingness to take on suffering indicates that a fundamental change has taken place in someone. It's a sign that they no longer live to satisfy their desires. And he says, now look, you live in a society in which people basically live to satisfy whatever desire they may happen to have at any given moment. That was true for the Greco-Roman world then. It's largely true for 21st century America as well. But notice the problem. Peter notices it. If life is fundamentally about merely satisfying momentary desires, that basically amounts to the admission that life really has no ultimate overarching purpose at all. There literally is no reason to live simply beyond the next pleasure or the next high or the next good feeling. There's nothing beyond it. And that way of living isn't the kind of life that's really worthwhile for a human being. That kind of life is not fitting for a human being. That kind of life has no meaning and has no purpose. And so Peter's saying, look, one of the things that's going on in suffering is when you take that on, what you're showing that you're not the kind of person who simply depends on momentary highs or the satisfaction of desires or the exercise of passions. But rather, something important has happened in your life. The fact that you don't simply live by your passions and desires is one of the effects of Christ's rule in your life. Christ is working to reform and reshape your desires, to put your desires under His rule, and to direct you into the kind of life that's worthy of a creature made in the image of God. To direct you to the kind of life that really does lead to a genuine and lasting and eternal happiness. That's what's going on in the Christian life. And the willingness to suffer indicates that that's the case. To put this in a slightly different way, Peter's calling us to think about what's going on in Jesus' own acceptance of suffering. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's contemplating what lies ahead, we're told that in Luke's gospel, remember, he begins to actually sweat blood at the thought of what lies ahead. And he even says, well, in effect, Father, if there's another way to accomplish your purposes, I would be happy to hear about it. But if this is the way that you've chosen, then let your will and not mine be done. What we're seeing there in the Garden of Gethsemane and then on to the cross is Jesus' total trust in his Father. His willingness to suffer is a witness to the fact that he is simply not a creature of his own passions and desires, but is looking forward to the coming rule of God. And that rule, of course, already exists perfectly in his own life. That's the exhortation that Peter is placing before the people in his congregation. I want to step back just a minute to make a comment about baptism, because Peter addresses this back in 3:18 to 22. He says, he draws his picture about the ark. He says, former they did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as the removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Now, I think Peter's saying a variety of things there, but certainly he's saying this. He's drawing now a relationship, he's trying to create an analogy between the flood back in Genesis and baptism. So let's see what that analogy says. In the flood in Genesis, remember, God sends a flood basically to purge and to cleanse the world. And in that flood, 8 persons, that is Noah and his family, are delivered in the ark, whereas the sinfulness of the world is in effect washed away. Peter's saying that something like that is taking place in baptism. That baptism is an act of cleansing, purification. In effect, just as the ark delivered some people through judgment, now baptism delivers God's people through judgment. But the thing that I want to underline here is the connection between the two. Both the flood and baptism are presented by Peter as being means of purification, as being means of cleansing, liberation, cleaning. I think that's a good image for Peter's whole picture of the Christian life. That is, for Peter, God's people are those people who have been washed and cleansed and purified by a kind of supernatural water, a cleansing that's been generated by Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. And that's fundamentally where the Christian life begins. It begins with a divine cleansing. It begins with God beginning to reshape and refashion our desires, our patterns of thinking, our patterns of feeling, and bending them back into the proper order, reorienting us away from sin and back to Him. And so in many ways for Peter, the Christian life is a journey back to God from a kind of far lost wilderness, the wilderness of sin, where we leave the wilderness and we come back toward God, eventually to end up in the promised land, which Peter thinks of as the kingdom of God. We'll pursue our journey through chapter 4 in the next presentation.